Hey everyone, so One Piece chapter 1112 just came out, which means the 3-week long break that we got very abruptly in the middle of the arc's climax is finally over, and we get right back into the action. So that was one of the roughest breaks of One Piece that we've ever had, just because usually I feel like the extended breaks tend to come at moments where a large section of the story is kind of closed, like back when Marineford ended and the time skip happened, or after the Wano arc. But this was in the middle of Vegapunk's countdown timer taking place, and it feels like one of the longest breaks in One Piece history, just because we were in the middle of the action when it happened. But the battle continues this chapter, and I have to say that the Gorosei are looking more and more impressive with each beat of this fight. So I know last chapter, people are still trying to place, as of the last chapter before the break, where exactly we can expect the Gorosei to kind of scale to. It's looking more and more like they are the endgame villains that were basically promised, in that the single standout moment of this chapter, I think, that most people are going to take away from all of this is the moment that Luffy tried to use Red Rock against War Curie, and it didn't work. Now, a lot of people might say that, well, Luffy wasn't in Gear 5th. He likely did not, as far as we could tell, he was not using Advanced Conqueror's Haki or anything like that. Therefore, not to make a huge deal out of this. But the thing is that this very same, while it's true Luffy was not using all of the abilities that he has at his disposal, we can make a direct comparison to Luffy using this exact same move, Red Rock, against Kaido. And whereas Kaido was completely floored by it and smashed to the ground, with War Curie, not only does War Curie not budge an inch, it's actually Luffy that is physically hurt just from punching War Curie's skin. That is insane. Because that is compared to who was previously considered one of, if not the toughest characters in the entire story, Kaido. The fact that Luffy was, with this very same Red Rock attack, able to at least deal damage to Kaido and knock him to the ground, and at the very least not come away with his hand throbbing in pain, that very same move being used on War Curie results in Luffy actually being the one who takes damage. That suggests, almost without a doubt, that War Curie is physically, in terms of his exterior, more durable, significantly tougher than even Kaido, who, again, up till now was the character that was most hyped up as basically being essentially the toughest creature out there. On top of that, we look at the previous chapter, where War Curie released some degree of Conqueror's Haki that, you know, even Kaido and Big Mom never even really approached in terms of scale, and it's just starting to look like, yeah, the Gorosei may be as strong as Kaido and Big Mom, maybe even stronger. Again, just quantity of Conqueror's Haki and physical durability aren't the only things that matter, but it is looking like the potential is there for them to be just as strong, if not maybe even stronger than some of the Yonko. So that is exciting stuff. Honestly, I feel like readers should not be opposed to that. I feel like that's more exciting for the end of the story. I feel like that's something that we should welcome and embrace. And I mean, who wants to feel like we've already hit the ceiling of what One Piece characters can be, you know, an arc ago? I mean, Kaido himself was speculating how high Luffy's ceiling can go. So yeah, let's go with it. You know, as Luffy's ceiling increases and keeps scaling up, we should have fittingly strong opponents to keep scaling up with that. So we got Imu, the Gorosei, perfectly fitting endgame opponents. The further this arc goes, the more confident I am that the Gorosei are most certainly not being defeated here whatsoever. I know that most people have been on that train for a long time, but there was that question mark. There was some speculation early on when the 5 Gorosei were dropped, which is like, is it possible that, you know, we get to see the Strauds versus, like, actually taking out some of the Gorosei here? I'm at this point still of the belief that this is a scenario specifically meant to hype up the Gorosei. The Strauds will get a symbolic win in terms of getting away, in terms of Vegapunk's message going out to the world, and the Gorosei's plans being f***ed up, but they themselves will be sufficiently hyped up as fittingly strong endgame villains. So this chapter was amazing for that. Even Jupiter, who I personally think is one of the weaker Gorosei, even he displayed basically some degree of ability with being able to create a vortex that was sucking in Luffy, Dory, and Brogy, and all 3 of them were struggling just to get away. So the Gorosei, even if earlier on it seemed as though they could kind of be messed up and they were, as some people were joking around, regeneration merchants, I think at least the War Curie feat this chapter firmly put an end to that, because it's actually more so like, not only does he have crazy Conqueror's Haki, not only does he have durability that is stronger than Kaido or Big Mom, on top of that, even if you somehow manage to damage him and get past that insane durability, he has infinite regeneration, which is just basically too many problems to deal with. And Venus, Juro, and Mars, of course, did not disappoint this chapter either. Venus, Juro, we've already seen, is insanely fast. So far, he's been technically the most competent Gorosei in terms of accomplishing his job. He's the only one that's accomplished exactly what he was supposed to do, which is take care of all the pacifista. So we get Venus, Juro on one hand. Best panel of the chapter, by the way, was Venus, Juro, the shadowy figure of Venus, Juro standing in front of the Straw Hats. It's an almost identical scenario, by the way, to when Saturn was in front of almost this exact same group, Frankie, Bonnie, beforehand. And we kind of know how that went down. So let's see what Venus Juro does here. Hopefully Sanji, who's in the vicinity, might be able to do something, but I know a lot of people have been hoping that Zoro would get in on the action. On the other end of things, we've got Mars. And Mars is shaping up to be one of my favorite Gorosei just because the design is part of it, but his actions and his demeanor help quite a bit. I loved his interaction with Lucci earlier. I loved his interaction with York here. There's just something to Mars that, whereas in his human form, he seems like the least noteworthy and most forgettable of the Gorosei, in demonic form, there seems to be almost something more sinister to him, more ominous and menacing to him than all of the other Gorosei. Not saying he's the strongest, just that he's got a certain vibe that, really leaves an impact on the reader, I think, in the last couple chapters. It also might be that Mars is the one that's specifically going after the actual objective of stopping Vegapunk's broadcast that makes his storyline just a tad bit more interesting to me than everything else that's going on right now. Mars also unleashed his own unique ability this chapter. It seems that he can fire some sort of giant Boro Breath-esque energy blast, and he could theoretically have used that to just tear apart all of the laboratory, but obviously York put a stop to that. And on that note, it is interesting to point out that all 5 of the Gorosei, we can tell that they all share the infinite regeneration aspect, but they all seem to have their own individual specialties as well. So Venus Juro seems to be extreme speed and ice abilities, right? Mars is flight, and it seems like energy blast or something along those lines. Then Warkiri, it seems to be, he has the strongest Conqueror's Haki as far as we can tell, and also just sheer physical toughness. So Warkiri might be the more just brute force member of the Gorosei in terms of just straight up raw power. And then Jupiter, we've got obviously the vortex ability that he displayed this chapter, along with his massive size. And finally Saturn, I've always felt, and many believe, that Saturn is maybe the weakest of the Gorosei, and what he's shown so far is more so poison based abilities, the poison blast that he shot out, and the eye abilities, the eye based abilities that he's used to freeze people, to use concussive blasts, things like that. So Saturn is maybe the most miscellaneous type member of the Gorosei, and maybe the least competent in terms of physical combat, but I might be making too many assumptions right there. So the Gorosei's individual powers are kind of revealing themselves over the course of this fight. Now Luffy, to many people's disappointment, did run out of Gear 5th pretty early on. It does seem to imply that his time limit is just about 9-10 minutes or so, because he only started using Gear 5th right before the fight began, with Saturn, Kizaru, etc., and then segueing into the rest of the Gorosei. Because Luffy's Gear 5th time limit is even tighter than his Gear 4th time limit was, which was 20 minutes, to me that suggests that it just goes to show that Gear 5th is meant to be just that broken, that hacks of an ability, and Oda really has to limit how long Luffy can be in that form, just for the sake of keeping things, competitive and not having to write Luffy in that, all-out mode too often. Although, again, the Gorosei were still a challenge for Luffy in Gear 5th. I'm just saying, in general, for the future, it seems as though that needs to be a kind of all-or-nothing trump card for Luffy. So by the end of the chapter, it did seem like Mars managed to get to the source of the broadcast, and we kind of got left on a cliffhanger right there of what might happen, whether he might be interrupted or something like that, what we might be setting up for next chapter. I still wonder where the Iron Giant is going to come into play, and in general, this chapter left us with a couple cliffhangers. Mars on his end, Saturn and how that's going to go down with Robin, Nami, and Usopp, because they're totally outmatched against this character. I would low-key be interested in seeing Robin in her, demonio fluor form trying to take on Saturn, just because we already got a little bit of that similar imagery with Robin in that form taking on Black Maria, but obviously Saturn is a totally different beast, arachnid, than Black Maria was, but it would just be a nice little interesting callback. We get that, and then the Venus Juro situation in front of some Straw Hats who are clearly going to be outmatched by him. And then lastly, we've got the question marks of what Zoro and Sanji and Jinbei are going to be doing, because they're the 3 strongest Straw Hats outside of Luffy. They're the only ones that could theoretically be some sort of a deterrent to any of the Gorosei, and they're nowhere to be seen, while 2 of the Gorosei are individually bearing down on some Straw Hats who have zero chance of taking them on. So I think next chapter is set to be a very exciting one. We've got 3 hanging plot threads that are up in the air, and we've obviously got Luffy, Dory, and Broggy just trying to survive against the 2 Gorosei that they're up against. It doesn't seem like Luffy's going to be using Gear 5th, maybe just in a hurry just yet. And lastly, we have a comment from the Voice of the People, my top tier of patrons. So Sunnyclip said, the depictions here making the Warcury, Venus, Mars ranking seem more tangible. Warcury tanking Luffy's special chapter 1000 attack was cool, great setup for the elevation of the enemy power. Yeah, this definitely goes to what I was talking about before in my video where I speculated about future Gorosei matchups, and in it, I theorized in particular that the order of strength of the Gorosei may just be in the order of planets that they represent. So from first to last, Warcury, then Venus Juro, then Mars, then Jupiter, and then Saturn. And in general, I think the Gorosei's strength may have been underestimated by us because the one that we saw in action the most throughout the arc was Saturn, of course. And while Saturn seemed strong, there was nothing so crazy that put him quite on the level of, Kaido or Big Mom or something like that, or Shanks. And because of that, it was easy to maybe underestimate the rest of the Gorosei, but now that we're seeing them in action, one, I do think it is becoming apparent, at least to me, if I were just to eyeball guess who's the most impressive Gorosei so far, I would say Warcury seems the most impressive, Saturn seems the least impressive. That gives credence, at least to me, to the possibility that the ranking of, the planetary order of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn does make sense. And then on top of that, Venus and Mars both also seem to be extremely competent Gorosei, which suggests that those 2 characters occupying the number 2 and number 3 slot makes sense. And then Jupiter, while formidable and does seem to have very powerful area of effect, using that vortex to suck everybody in, having the largest size of the Gorosei, I still think that in terms of what he's actually accomplished, it hasn't been much, so him being number 4, I think that sort of follows. And then finally, of course, Saturn being number 5, the first and weakest of the Gorosei that we encountered, who has had the least success against the protagonist so far, I think. I think that all makes sense, and it does follow why maybe we underestimated the Gorosei initially, because Saturn doesn't seem that crazy strong, but at the same time, Warcury is seeming to be extremely difficult to deal with. So I would argue that based on what we're seeing, maybe the top end of Gorosei do scale to about what we would call maybe Yonko level, maybe even above some of the Yonko. It's hard to say just yet. I think we don't have enough evidence, but it does seem more and more like the Gorosei are shaping up to be fitting endgame level opponents. And so I'm definitely looking forward to next week's chapter and seeing how the rest of this fight plays out, and I will talk to you all later.